this video, we're going to make 10 really fun and easy sewing projects that you can sew, sell, and gift. But most importantly, these projects are really great to practice your serger skills. As the title suggests, all of these projects can be completed entirely on your serger or your overlocker. But as always, you can make them on a sewing machine as well. Just take the idea and have fun. You will also see timestamps right there in the description of this video for your convenience, so that way you can go through the project and pick the ones that you like. And we're going to start with the one that's real easy and everybody will be able to make one. You can make it for yourself, you can make it as a gift. It's these cute little headbands. As any other sewing project, let's start with the fabric. Here, the main criteria is that this fabric needs to have a significant amount of stretch and then be able to bounce back. Definitely take a look in your fabric scrap box to see what you have there, but I would say that a no-fail option would be cotton spandex or cotton lycra mix, the same mix that we used to make socks and undies in the same series. You can use the same measurements as I will be using for a headband for myself and then for my daughter, but do remember that they may vary depending on your own head circumference and on the stretchiness of your fabric. For that, take a measuring tape and measure your full head circumference. Then decrease it a little bit to account for the stretchiness of the fabric. So for example, my full head circumference is 23 inches. I'm going to take that and decrease it by about 3 inches or so. So the total length of one of my strips is going to be about 20.5 inches. Now, if you're just not sure, that's totally fine. Start with your full head circumference first, and then at the very last step, you can decrease by the necessary amount after you try it on your head. The width of my strips are going to be 4.5 inches, and that's just how wide it is from one brown strip to the other brown strip. For you, it can be 5 inches, it can be 4 inches, it can be more or less. Definitely play around. Don't stress about that measurement too much. For each headband, we're going to cut 2 strips. Each one will be cut in the direction of the greatest stretch. The first step is to bring the long edge right sides together, align it, you can pin it if that helps, and then serge it. Here at the serger, I'm using just a basic 4-thread technique, the simplest of the techniques that you would use for just a regular construction of any other thing that you would do on a serger. Once you have one of these done, we're going to repeat all of the same steps on the second one. After that, turn these right side out. Even if you're tempted, don't skip this next step. Position the seam so that way it's sort of in the middle of the strip, and then give it a good press. Please remember to check the settings on your iron and the fiber content of your fabric, and if the two of those are compatible. Now we have to link these together. So with the seam up, I'm going to bring the short ends together. So now the seam is on the inside, and I'm going to do the same on the other one. Then I'm going to bring the looped sides, so the fold sides, one next to another, and bring one through, placing it back the way it should be. So this is what we're going to get. Here's another look at it with 2 different colors, so perhaps you can see a little bit better. The seam is on the inside. These are folded. I'm going to grab the blue one, bring it through. The seam still should stay on the inside, and then I'm bringing the short ends. Ta-da! This is what we want. The last step is to bring these ends together and sew them. I will once again demonstrate it on this colorful example so you can see better. So once you have your ends like this, bring them over. Now, on whichever side, it doesn't really matter. Let's take the pink one. Take this part, flip it with the seam out, and bring it over to the other side of the sandwich, like this. So we have pink on both sides and then blue in the middle. For the pink, the seam is facing to the outside. Now at the serger, we're going to sandwich it all together. If needed, this is the step where you would perhaps pin this all together with a safety pin first, then try it on your head, and if needed, decrease equally from each side so that way it fits just perfectly. When done, I'm going to use a latch hook to hide these serger tails inside of the seam. Next, simply unfold these so that way the seams are all facing to the inside. And that's it. Your headband is done. The project for today is this pieced blanket. It's also a great scrap buster, and we're going to complete it by using a flat lock technique on a serger. For this project, I'm going to be using fleece that I had left over from making these couch cushions, and then I also had a corresponding print totally by chance, but I thought that these two greens will go really nice together. So what I did, I started by cutting them into squares, and each square measures about 7.5 inches or approximately 19.5 centimeters. And as always, these are just my measurements according to what fabric scraps I had. You can use your own, and those don't have to be squares. You can also work with rectangles. Now you will need to decide how big you want your blanket to be. Mine is going to be on a smaller size, just a little play blanket, 4 squares in each direction. Next, let's set up our machine. And as I mentioned, we're going to be using a flat lock seam. That's where we're going to be loosening up the tension on the needle and the upper looper, one more than the other. And we're going to be tightening up the lower looper so that way we can pull the seam apart and therefore it can be almost entirely flat, hence the name of the technique, flat lock. So first what we're going to do is we're going to remove one of the needles. In my case, I will be removing the right needle. Once the needle is out, I like to remove the thread cone that corresponds to that needle, and now we can set it aside. Next, we're going to thread it just like we normally would. Once the threading is done, it's time to set our tension, and I always sort of say that that's where the real magic happens. Starting with the left needle, the one that's still in a serger, here we're going to loosen up the tension, and in my case, I'm going to bring it down all the way to 0. Sometimes number 1 works as well, it just depends on the fabric. We're now going to adjust anything on the right needle because that's the needle that we took out. When it comes to the upper looper, we also want to loosen it up, but just by a tiny bit. So for right now, let's set it down to 3. And when it comes to the lower looper, here we want to tighten it up. So I'm going to bring it all the way up to number 7. Now we're going to do a test run and see how it works. Once you have your little sample, you want to pull the fabric pieces apart so that way you can assess if the seam is flat enough or if you need to adjust anything on the settings. And I think that so far it's actually pretty perfect. Now I just did a full step-by-step detailed video with troubleshooting on a flat lock seam and what to know, how to do it. So if you need more problem solving and adjustments, then definitely check it out. It's a short video, but it will help you out. I will leave the link in the description. Another thing that I would suggest doing here, especially if you are working with fleece, is actually increasing the stitch length. As you saw, I went from 3 up to 4, that's the max on my serger, and it's a simple rule of thumb that applies to both sergers and sewing machines. When you're working with really thick fabrics, increase the stitch length. When you're working with really thin fabrics, decrease it. In thicker fabrics, it will help you to go smoother through all of the layers, and in the thinner fabrics, it will help to reduce all the puckering. Now all we have to do is grab our squares, place these right sides together, align them at the sides, and start serging. Flat lock is also a double-sided technique, so it's really versatile. And here I have 2 small examples on scrap fabric, and you can see that I prefer the one where you place your fabric right sides together, but you can also opt for the other one. It's definitely up to you. Now, I personally prefer working in rows, so from here, you just continue adding squares until you're done with all of the squares in one row. Now, once we got all of our rows done, now we're going to connect them. And the same principle as we did before, we're going to place these right sides together, we're going to align everything, and then serge. To make sure that everything really does match up as I serge, I like to add a pin at the intersection of all of these seams. From here, continue piecing the rows together until you're done with the entire blanket. If you're worried about some of the threads popping out and the seam coming apart right here at the intersection, I totally hear you. I have that happen once in all of the years using a flat lock seam, so definitely food for thought. So I figured that when you're piecing your rows, instead of letting the serger cut off the serger tails at the intersection, go ahead and cut them off yourself. Leave yourself a little bit of an allowance. When you are just about to serge over that spot, instead of letting the serger cut it off, you either retract your serger knife and then serge over it, or you serge over it very carefully without cutting anything off. That way, that serger tail is tucked in and not cut off. Now the last and final step before we're done is to finish the edge. And here the first thing that I want to do is I want to round the corners. After that, as you can see, I have reverted back to a regular 4-thread serging. So I've inserted back the right needle, so now I have 2 needles. I have 4 cones of thread and it's threaded as per usual. And I've also brought back all of the tension settings 4, 4, 4, and 5. Now I'm simply going to serge all the way around. I like to start a little bit away from the corner, and if you do have a busy print in your blanket, start there. That way it's less noticeable. Now when you do get to the corner, just like you would on a sewing machine, slow down, and as you're pivoting, you leave the needles inside of your project, lift up the presser foot, then pivot the fabric and continue. A little bit of practice will definitely make this perfect, and your corners are going to turn out real nice. When we have come all the way around and we're ready to finish it up, the first thing that I do is I snip off the threads at where we started. After that, I serge a little bit past that point so that way we can lock all of the threads in. However, be careful not to snip anything off with a serger knife, otherwise that defeats the purpose. Once you're done, simply pull the project away as you continue serging and then snip off the thread. After that, just tuck it in and hide it and you're all done. Project number 3 in this video is going to be great for both kids and adults because we're going to be making socks. That's right, socks. And it might seem like quite a gimmicky idea at the very beginning. I totally hear you. So we've been wearing them and testing them for over a week now, and the conclusion is from both myself and my daughter is that these are nice, comfortable, wearable socks. This is a great project for all of those knit fabric scraps that you might have, so that way you can use them up and in the process make something useful. But keep in mind that you will need knit fabric scraps that stretch in both directions, so horizontally and vertically. You can also do this project by hand on a sewing machine, but in today's particular video, we are going to be using a serger. Now the pattern that I'm using today is a free pattern by Ellie and Mac. It's a wonderful, brilliant pattern with lots of explanations, so definitely don't skip on those, read it through, and everybody can download this free pattern. You can find a link in the description right underneath this video. Now sometimes I get a comment that people don't know where the description of the video is, so you can just Google that and find it. Or alternatively, you can also type in free Ellie and Mac sock pattern in your web browser and you'll be able to find and download this pattern without a problem. The file itself is quite large, but the pattern pieces are actually only on 4 pages, so you don't have to print everything out, just these 4. Once done, tape these together and assemble as per instructions in the file. After you have determined what size you need to cut, so in my case, it's going to be size 13 for my daughter. We can either trace the pattern pieces that we need, or we can cut it straight from here. These are the pattern pieces that you're going to have after cutting everything out. Now, neither my daughter or I like long socks for the most part, so the ones that I'm going to be making are quite shorter than the ones that you're going to see as samples in the original pattern. All of the other steps are going to be exactly the same, but if you do want your socks on the shorter side, here's what you're going to do. Grab the pattern piece that reads front, from top, measure down the necessary amount by which you need to shorten your sock. In my case, it's going to be 8 centimeters or approximately 3 inches, and then draw a straight line. Then grab the pattern piece that reads back top and shorten it by exactly the same amount. And again, draft a straight line. After that, simply cut off the unnecessary length, and that's it. You have adjusted your pattern. From here, grab your fabric and the pattern pieces, position them according to the markings on the patterns, then secure with pins and cut them out. Please note that it says here on the patterns that 1/4 inch seam allowance is already included. Now when you're cutting your pattern pieces, make sure that you also mark all of the little notches that you see on the patterns themselves. Now usually I would just snip into the fabric and mark the notches this way, but it's better in this particular case for this particular project to use a marking tool like a chalk or a washable marker. Now onto the assembly. First, let's set up our serger. Today we're going to be using a 3-thread serger technique instead of a regular 4-thread technique, and there are 2 reasons why I decided to do that for this particular project. Number 1, 3-thread technique is stretchier than a 4-thread technique, therefore the seam has more flexibility. Now the difference is small, however in projects like these it does matter. Number 2, 3-thread technique creates less bulk than a 4-thread technique, which in turn is going to give you a really nice round result right here in the toe area and at the heel. And it also creates less bulk for you to feel in the seam. And that was my number 1 concern when I was making these socks, because my daughter, she will tell you right away if something doesn't feel right. And so far, she hasn't said a word, but instead she's been reaching for these socks every single day when she goes to school. So I would say that this definitely works, 3-thread technique, for those 2 reasons. To do this, you're going to start by removing your right needle. Once that is done, we're going to thread our serger as per usual, set up the tension as per usual. Everything else stays in the stitch finger and the knife. And I'm going to replace one of my thread cones that goes into the left needle with a purple thread, but I will leave the rest of them white so that way you can see the seam on this example. Now grab the pattern piece that says back bottom with the notches right over here facing up. Then grab the pattern piece that says back top with the notches facing down. For me, it's this little pattern piece because we did adjust the length of the sock. Now place these right sides together, aligning at the curve and at the notches. So right here at the notches, what I want to do is I want to make a little mark right over here and a little mark right over here. So that way I know where to stop and start once we're at the serger. If you want, you can also pin right over here. At the serger, first start by chaining off. Then grab our project. Here's the little notch mark. Lift up the presser foot, lift up the needle, and place your project right underneath. Right over here, there is a little spot on the presser foot where you can actually see the fabric. So you want this mark to be right underneath the needle. When doing a curve on a serger, I stop and go quite often. While I do that, I lift up the presser foot and I readjust the project underneath it, so that way I can get a really nice curve without any jagged edges. As soon as you have reached the other notch, and you can see it right over here, lift up your presser foot, lift up the needle, pull the project away as much as you can, and then chain off. The name of this pattern piece is front. This part will belong to the toe area, so we want to place it like so, aligning at the curve. Now the heel, we actually want to open up like this, and while we're holding it, place the rest of the pattern piece over it. Have the heel facing sideways all the way flat, like so, and then let's start pinning all the way around. Now I actually prefer sewing from this side so I can clearly see how much of this heel am I catching. So if you'd like to, you can reposition your pins, and let's head to the serger. Here I'm going to start by removing the pin. I'm going to gently hold with my fingers this top part and very, very slightly pull the heel a little bit away. So that way I don't catch a lot of fabric in the seam. Otherwise, it will be quite chewed up in that area and uncomfortable. Now I'm going to place it underneath the presser foot and the needle, lower it, and start serging. Once you have reached this area, we're going to hold the top with our finger like so. We're going to take the heel and ever so slightly pull it away from the rest of the seam. Exactly the same thing that we did previously. And now we're going to serge over it. This is what you're going to have once done. Now grab one of the pattern pieces of a band, place the short ends together, and let's serge it. When we're done, we can give it a good press and then turn everything right side out. Now let's take the band and place it over the opening of the sock, and I personally like having this seam at the back, so at the center back, not at one of the other seams. I like it at the back. So place it over the opening like so. Align it, and let's head to the serger. Here we simply need to make sure that we catch all layers in one seam. So 2 layers of the band and 1 layer of the sock, and we're going to be serging it in the round. Now tuck in the serger tail, and that's it, your sock is done. I want to give 2 extra tips for those who did watch till the end. Number 1, if you would like to have your serger seam even narrower so that way you feel it even less as you wear your socks, then instead of removing the right needle, remove the left needle. But do keep in mind that the seam allowance on this pattern is marked as 1/4 inch. 1/4 inch is just about the width of a regular 4-thread or 3-thread seam on the serger. By removing the left needle, you're making the seam narrower, therefore you will need to adjust the seam allowances on the pattern as well. Tip number 2 is that if you see that your fabric becomes wavy and sort of puckers as you serge your socks, sometimes you can see it more in the round areas, then crank up your differential feed. Mine goes from 1 all the way up to 2. Your measurement might be a little bit different, but basically what it does, by increasing the differential feed, your serger gathers the fabric ever so slightly as you work through your project, therefore preventing that waviness and puckers. You might not notice, but a serger is a really great tool when it comes to creating useful household items. You know, things like napkins, swaddle cloths, beautiful scarves, and many more. All by using just one simple technique. And that's exactly what we're going to be doing in this serger only project. We're going to do a beautiful rolled hem with a 90-degree corner in order to create a set of napkins, and then a rolled hem with a rounded corner in order to create a set of swaddle cloths. Another really great thing about these projects is that at their base, it's only a square or a rectangle, so it really makes it easy in order to cut and get going. For swaddle cloths, I'm going to be using this really nice double gauze cotton cut into a square about 40 by 40 inches. And then I'm going to use a little template in order to round the corners. As always, all fabrics have already been washed and dried. Next, we need to set up your serger for a rolled hem. First, we're going to remove your stitch finger. Here it is. Next, we're going to remove one of the needles. You can choose between the left needle or the right needle. Removing the left needle is going to give you a narrow rolled hem. Removing the right needle is going to give you a more wider one. Next, you're going to thread it as per usual, but you will remove the thread cone that corresponds to the needle that you took out. In my case, I took out the right needle. Next, we're going to adjust a few settings that we have here on these knobs. First is going to be the stitch length. Currently it's set on 3 for normal serging, so I'm going to turn it all the way to R. My differential feed is going to stay as is, set for normal serging at 1. And I'm also going to leave my stitch width as is as well, set for 5. Now onto the thread tension. Now it will depend slightly on the type of fabric that you're using, but basically a rolled hem is created by slightly loosening up the upper looper. I'm going to set mine at 3 and tightening up your lower looper. And I have already tested this on the double gauze fabric that I'm going to be using. So I found that going all the way up to 8 is a good setting. but for your fabric, you might want to go down to 7 or even 6, so definitely test. For the needle, most of the times I will either leave it at 4 or at 3. In this case, I'm actually going to stay at 4. Now, if you do want to know how to problem solve and troubleshoot this technique, how to use a different kind of thread in order to create a pop of color on the edge, and many more things when it comes to the rolled hem, then I do have a very detailed video that goes over all of these, and I will link it for you guys in the description. And that video will be perfect for those who are just starting with the serger or just venturing into other serger techniques that you haven't used before. For a rounded corner, I like to start somewhere on the side, a little bit away from the corner itself. Make sure that you have a little thread chain to start with. Then place your project right underneath the presser foot, lower it, and start serging. Now, one of the benefits of a serger is that it has a blade that cuts off and neatens the fabric as we move it through the serger. But I do find that when we're talking about rounded corners, it makes it much easier and much neater if we cut off just the tiniest bit or nothing at all. So that's exactly what we're going to do. When you get to the corner, go slow and steady. Stop if you need to, slightly lift up the presser foot with your finger and readjust the fabric so that way it goes right underneath the needle and against the blade. Then continue doing this as much as you need as you get through the curve. The first couple of rounded corners that you do might come out a little bit wonky, but please do continue practicing and you'll be making beautiful rounded corners in no time. Now, when you're ready to finish up your blanket or your napkin, what I like to do is I like to snip off the thread chain that we started with. Then we're going to serge just about ½ an inch or a little bit more over it, but when you do that, try not to cut anything off with the blade, otherwise you'll be cutting off the already existing stitching. Once you have serged over the beginning, go ahead and make sure that your needle is up, lift up your presser foot, and then remove the project a little bit, then lower the presser foot and chain off. Here's how this is going to look up close. From here, you can tie this thread into a knot and then snip off the ends. Here's a quick reminder when you're sewing for little babies. Double check what fabric you're using, what is and what isn't allowed, as well as what kind of requirements and guidelines you need to follow. Alright, next let's do a set of napkins with a 90-degree corner. Here I've picked up this quilting cotton from the fabric store and cut into squares 13 inches by 13 inches, but you can of course choose your own measurements. Since this is a different fabric, I have adjusted my settings. I have removed the left needle and left the right needle in, and I've also loosened up the lower looper tension. Here's my napkin, and I'm actually going to start at the very corner, but do a couple of practice runs so that way you can determine what really works for you. Let's go ahead, lift up the presser foot, place the napkin right there at the very tip of the needle and start serging. Now, don't be afraid to stop if you need to. Don't feel like you have to complete an entire hem in one go. And notice that I'm cutting off with my knife just the tiniest bit of the fabric. You don't want to cut too much, otherwise your corners are going to come out a little bit funny looking. Now, once I'm getting closer to the bottom, I want to make sure that I serge almost all the way to the bottom of the napkin, leaving just enough space for about 1 stitch. Let me get up here real close and mark it with a heat erasable pen. Now I'm going to sew all the way, stopping at that line. And here on your serger, you have a little window where you can see how your stitching is formed, so you can definitely see when you're approaching that line. Once I'm there, I've stopped, I will lift up my needle and my presser foot. I will go ahead and tug my project just a tiny bit so that way I can turn it around like so. But now what I've done, I've actually pulled the threads, so if I start serging right now, they will be forming little loops at the very corner. So in order to avoid that, let's go ahead and tug those threads up. So that way we return them to the previous tension for a normal stitch. Lower your presser foot And make sure that you position your corner so that way the needle starts right at the top and start serging again. Once you're at the bottom of the other corner, let's go ahead and repeat all of the steps. Once you're ready to finish your napkin, just go ahead and serge all the way down by cutting off this little tail. Once done, I usually like to separate the serger tail into the threads so that way I can tie them in knots and then thread them into sewing needle and tuck the ends into the seam. That was quick and easy, wasn't it? Now for those of you who clicked on this video but you don't have a serger, please don't feel discouraged. Simply substitute anything that we do on a serger with a zigzag stitch, a lightning stitch, or any other stretch stitch that you have on your sewing machine and you'll be good to go. To get started on this project and really practice our serger skills and in the process make something useful, you will need to download a free pattern. And I use the one from Waves and Wild. And a beautiful thing about that pattern is that it comes in two options. It comes in briefs or in boxers. The pattern is only about 7 pages, so it really doesn't take much to print it out. Plus, the instructions that come with the pattern on how to put this all together are really great, so you're going to be in good hands. Now, after you have your pattern all taped together, you can either cut the size that you need, or in my case, I prefer tracing it. In terms of fabric for the undies, I like to use a mix between 95% cotton and 5% spandex. This is knit and it stretches in both directions, so it features a 4-way stretch. For the inside liner, however, I do like to use 100% cotton knit. Now, since I'm using this project also as a way how to incorporate some of the fabric scraps for the bands, I'm using a slightly different knit combination. This time it is 90% cotton and 10% spandex. So as you can see, you can definitely mix and match. Now I'm working on the pattern for briefs, which features 5 pattern pieces. A really important thing to pay attention to is the direction of the stretch and how many of those pattern pieces you will need to cut. So first we have the front pattern piece. It's cut on the fold, so if I remove this pin, right here the fabric is folded and the direction of the stretch goes this way. Then we have the back pattern piece, which is also cut on the fold right over here with the same direction of stretch. Then we have a waistband for the top. The thing here is that it also is cut on the fold, but I did run out of fabric scraps. Therefore, instead of cutting one pattern piece on a fold, I cut 2 pattern pieces and I'm going to create seams on both sides. Next, we have 2 leg bands. They're both cut on the fold right over here, and also the inside liner or a gusset, also cut on the fold with the same direction of stretch. The pattern also already includes 1/4 inch seam allowance, so you don't have to add anything. To get started, we need to grab the front pattern piece and open it up like this. Next, grab the back pattern piece and also open it flat, but this time face down, so the right side of the fabric facing down. We will also need the inside gusset or the lining piece. We want to choose the side that has the seam allowance, and you will see that it's angled a little bit, so that's the one that you want. You want to place it also wrong side up, right here on the back pattern piece. Next, exactly as it is, bring it over the front pattern piece. It is easier to pin it the other way around, so I'm going to flip it, pin it, and with this 3-layer sandwich, we're going to head to the serger. I will be using just a regular 4-thread serger technique, and as I mentioned before, this pattern already includes a 1/4 inch or 6mm seam allowances. Now, if you're just not sure how wide is your serger seam, what you can do is grab a scrap piece of fabric, run it through your serger, and then measure the width of the seam. If you need to make it wider, most sergers have a width adjustment knob. You simply need to turn it in order to adjust it, and then measure again until you get the width that you need. Next, place the part that we have pinned right underneath the serger presser foot, lower it, and run it through your serger. This is what you're going to have once done. Place and open your undies like this. Take the gusset and now fold it in the opposite direction so the seam is totally enclosed. A great additional step is to give this area a quick little press that will truly ensure that this area is nice and flat. Since this part of the liner isn't attached as per instructions of the pattern, we're going to use a couple of pins to hold it together. Now I will give you a few tips on how to make sure that it is attached, and we're going to take a look at it as soon as we're done with this one. Further, we're going to grab the pattern like this and bring the side seams together. We're going to pin them on one side, aligning all of the edges, and we're going to pin them on the other side the same way. Now at the serger, we're going to serge it here and here. If instead of a really nice flat seam, your serger gives you a really wavy one, please remember that you can generally remedy that by adjusting your differential feed. Now, if you want to know what differential feed is, how it works, and how to adjust it and what kind of result we can get out of it, then please take a look at the entire serger series that I made just for you, so that way you can truly get all of the benefits that serger has and you can truly understand how it works and therefore really unleash your creativity. I will leave the links to all of the episodes in the description of this video. Next, we need to sew the leg bands and the waistband. Here we're going to place them right sides together. For the waistband, as I mentioned, I had to cut them separate instead of a fold, so I'm going to have a seam here and a seam here, right sides facing. For the leg bands, we're just going to have one seam, so place them right sides together. So one over here and the other one over here. Once done, let's start with the waistband. It's going to be the pattern piece that's the widest. To minimize the bulk that is created by this seam allowance, once we're going to be folding it, what we can do is a little bit of seam nesting. Now you can clip in here and that is going to create a better result. But for those who don't want to clip, all you have to do is simply push the seam allowance in two separate directions, right in the middle, and then while holding it, fold it wrong sides together, like this. Now the seam allowances are looking in a different directions. Next, let's turn the waistband up so the raw edges are facing up. We're going to place it right sides together with the main project and pin at each of the side seams. You can also add a little pin in the middle to hold it all together. Just like this, at the serger, we're going to serge in the round. The waistband is a little bit shorter than the top opening of the undies, so you will need to stretch it a little bit as you go. It's done the same way as you would when you're installing elastic. Now, if it is easier for you to have the waistband on top instead of underneath like I have right here, then pin accordingly and switch it in places. With the top being complete, now we're going to do exactly the same steps with the leg bands. Now the pattern suggests to line up the seam of the leg band with the side seam of the undies. But what I would do is I would actually push them a little bit towards the back, so that way you don't have two quite thick seams meeting one on top of another like I did right over here. While pinning the leg band, keep in mind that we also have the little gusset that we have to sandwich in, since it's not attached just yet. So just be very mindful of that and make sure that it's all lined up and pinned nicely. Now we're going to serge it in the round like we did with the waistband. When I work on projects like these, I find myself stopping and readjusting quite often. When I do that, I try to make sure that the needles are inside of the project so they don't move and I can continue seam smoothly. The last thing for us to do is to tuck in all of the serger ends and of course give it a really good press. Now let's take a look at it from the outside, from the right side of the fabric. And of course, let's take a look on the inside as well. Here's that gusset that I was talking about. On one side it's sewn and on the other one it's left as is. So let me show you a little alteration that you can do in order to enclose both ends. We're going to start by grabbing the front pattern piece and the little piece of the lining, the inside piece. We're going to place them like this because they match. And right here on top, we're going to outline where the lining ends. Next, we're going to fold it right on this line. You don't have to cut it off, you just need to fold it. And that's how we're going to cut the front pattern piece. The only thing is that now here on the bottom, we need to add 1/4 inch seam allowance as you cut your fabric. You can see it right over here. When it comes to the inner lining, now we will need to cut 2 of those. One for the inside, one for the outside, to extend the missing piece of the front pattern piece. Here we're going to do the same. We will need to add a seam allowance right here on the top. Once again, you can see it over here. For this next step, we can start with the front pattern piece or the back pattern piece. It doesn't really matter. We're going to open up the front pattern piece like this. Take the outer gusset, place it. And now we're going to take the inner gusset and we're going to place it right side down, and we're going to align it from the other side like this. Now we're going to pin it together and take it to the serger. When the seam is done, first give it a good press from this side, then open up both of the gussets, align them, and give it a good press from this side. And this is what we have so far. Next, grab the back pattern piece right here where we need to connect it to the front. First, we're going to connect it to the outside fabric, right sides together, and pin it. Next, we're going to do a little burrito flip, so just follow the movement of my hands. You're going to grab this loose piece of the gusset, bring it over like this, fold the back pattern piece on the inside, bring the raw edge of the gusset of the inside together where we have pinned, remove the pins and re-pin it, so that way now you have a 3-layer seam. That's how you're going to take it to the serger. When you're done, simply pull everything out, give it a good press, and ta-da! Now you have the inside liner with both ends enclosed. The rest of the steps are finished exactly the same as we did in the first example, and there you have it, the final result. So we're going to be working today on reusable cotton rounds. Those are to remove makeup from your face, but by using exactly the same technique and just changing up the size and the shape, you can transform this into burp cloths, into cleaning rags, and also into unpapered towels. So definitely plenty of room to get creative and to use up whatever materials you have. In terms of fabric, we're going to need cotton toweling, and you can use the towels that you already have at home. Perhaps you have one too many, or you can also buy full yardage from the fabric store. And for the other side of the cotton rounds, I like to use just plain cotton fabric. Now that's my personal preference. If you find that you use both sides of your cotton rounds, then you can just sandwich 2 sides of the cotton toweling together. So it's definitely up to you. Since the circle is the star of the shape for the video today, let's start by cutting circles out of toweling and out of cotton fabric. You can use any measurements that you find appropriate, but you can find the measurements that I use on your screens right now. For this next step, we actually have 2 options of serging that circle. The first one is real simple. You take your toweling, you take your cotton, you place these wrong sides together like this, and then you head to the serger. For the other option, we're actually going to mark 1/4 inch away from the edge of the circle, and then you cut it out. So first, we're going to start with a simpler one. At the serger, we're going to stay with a regular 4-thread technique, the one that you're going to use for most of your serger needs. The only thing to keep in mind is that toweling is quite brittle, so oftentimes it is going to shed. So in order to prevent that, since here the serger seam is going to be exposed, you might want to decrease your stitch length. For me, it's this knob right over here, and I will go from 3 down to 2. Start by chaining off and creating a serger tail. Then I prefer placing the toweling down on the feed dogs. Place it right underneath your presser foot. And it is going to get a little bit tight because it is quite thick, so you might want to bring up the presser foot a little bit higher and then lower it. Now the circle is small and the fabric, as I mentioned, is thick, so I prefer having both hands like this so that way we can control it better. And now let's start serging. As you can see, I'm only cutting off just the tiniest bit with a serger knife, and I'm moving the circle and turning it as I serge. Sometimes you also might experience that the edges of your circle come out a little wavy. That can usually be remedied very easily with just a really nice press or by increasing the differential feed on your serger. So in my case, going from 1 up to 2. As soon as you start getting closer to the beginning of our seam, we're gonna go over just about ½ an inch or so. While we're doing that, we're trying not to cut off any of the edges of the existing seam because we don't want it to come undone. Once done, go ahead, lift up the needles, lift up the presser foot, pull the project a little bit away, then lower the presser foot and chain off. Now all you have to do is just tuck in this tail and you're good to go. In the first example, we didn't really cut off anything of our circle. In the second one, we're going to be using this cutout, and we're going to be cutting away 1/4 inch as we serge around. This cutout is going to let us get a really nice smooth start and smooth finish. We want to place the cutout right underneath the needles and then lower your presser foot. I like to have the edge of the cutout right here at the knife. Now you're going to be rotating the circle as you serge, but at the same time, you will also need to make sure that you cut off an even amount on all sides, about 1/4 inch. I also find that because of that, I stop and go, lift up the presser foot and then lower it a lot more often than I did in the first option. Once you get to the beginning of the seam, you're simply going to do all the same steps as we did in the first example. Now personally, I find this second option a lot more cumbersome, but sometimes we do need to cut off the edge for whatever reason, and making that little cut really helps to get a smooth start and smooth end. As you can tell, we're going to be making these cute scrunchies, and here you can choose a solid color or a pattern that would suit you, or go for something fun and colorful for the little ones. It's also a great scrap buster, and if you take a look on the very edge, you will see that we have an exposed seam, which in turn is sort of like the secret element that allows us to construct this entire scrunchie on serger only without involving a sewing machine. So now let's talk about what we're going to need. First, elastic. And no matter how I make my scrunchies on a sewing machine or on a serger, I like to use wide elastic. It's about 3/8 of an inch wide or about 1 centimeter. And in this case, I'm gonna cut it to about 8.5 inches or 21 centimeters. When it comes to fabric, you can use both woven or you can use knits, just use whatever you have. And in this case, it's not even one solid piece of fabric. It's just all little pieces pieced together because that's what I had. Now, the length of my fabric is going to be approximately, I would say, 32 inches or so, or 82 centimeters. When it comes to the width, I would say between 3 to 4 inches, which would be between 7.5 and about 10 centimeters. The first thing that we need to do is to join the ends of our fabric. So grab your fabric like this, place it right sides together at the short ends, and that's where we're going to sew. And we're going to do that on our serger using a 4-thread, just a basic 4-thread serger technique. Once done, you're going to have a loop like this. And if you're working on multiple scrunchies like I am, then go ahead and complete the same task on all of them. Once that is done, next we need to join our elastic in a loop as well. And we're also going to do that on a serger. The first thing that we need to do is to overlap it by about 1 inch or 2.5 centimeters. I also find that pinning it in this direction does help keep it all together once we start serging. Here at the serger, make sure that you disengage the knife. Yours might be as easy as pushing a button, or like mine, you can manually turn it down. Then take your elastic and you want to place it underneath your presser foot about ½ inch before your overlap starts. So place it very carefully underneath your presser foot, lower it. At this point, I like to remove the pin that holds it all together. And now we're going to start serging it. Once you're about ½ inch past the overlap, go ahead and chain off and then snip it off. And you're going to repeat exactly the same thing on the other side. Then you can tuck in your serger tails, and after that you're going to have a joined elastic that is still stretchy, everything as it should be, but this time it was done on a serger instead of a sewing machine. Now we're ready to grab our fabric and grab our elastic. So I find that it's easier if you hold your elastic like this, then you take your fabric, bring the fabric through the elastic, bringing the wrong sides together like so, and then pin it. But we're not going to pin it all the way around because I find it unnecessary and also very time consuming. We're just going to pin this very little bit at the beginning point. Here I'm going to give you a couple of options. So let's say you're feeling adventurous, but you want to start by dipping in your toe, so just a little bit, not too difficult. Then I would say the easiest way to go about it would be to leave everything as is. So right now we have it set up for a regular 4-thread serging. The stitch finger is in, everything is in, so as it would normally be. And the only thing that we're going to change is stitch length. So from 3, which would be a normal setup for my serger, I'm gonna go down to R. In your case, you want to decrease it to one of the smallest amounts. That will pack the stitches close together, which in turn is going to create a really nice and beautiful edge on our scrunchies. Make sure that you bring the blade back up. Grab our scrunchie where we have pinned it together. Place it underneath the presser foot, lower the presser foot, take out the pin, and start serging. Once you have reached a point where you don't have all the fabric aligned together, go ahead, reach in, grab more fabric, place it together like so, pinch it with your fingers, and continue serging. When you are approaching the overlap with the start of the seam, let's go ahead and snip off the tail, like so. Stretch out this part just a little bit so that way it's nice and flat. Here you want to be really careful. You want to overlap the seam, I would say by about ½ inch or so, but you don't want to cut anything off with a knife. Once you got that, continue serging while very gently pulling the scrunchie away from the serger. And then snip it off. Next, just tuck in the thread tail and that's it, you're done. There's something really fun about these serger scrunchies, especially about that little pop of color on the edge. And here you can experiment with different threads. And in my case, I love using variegated thread because, I think it just adds a little bit of interest, but you can also use just a solid color as well. And if you're looking for which thread is going to show up the most, then that would be your upper looper thread. That's what you see right here in the green. Now, as I mentioned, here we have a couple of options. For those who are more adventurous, we are going to make a couple of adjustments. And the first one is going to be by removing the left needle.
Once the needle is out, let's also remove the cone that goes with that needle. And these particular settings of this next one are sort of my own variation between a 3-thread serging and a rolled hem. It's sort of like a little hybrid, because in my case, I'm working with a knit that's not light, and especially 2 layers of it don't really respond well to a traditional rolled hem. With traditional rolled hem, the thinner the fabric, the easier for serger it is to roll it. So I find that in this particular case, I leave the stitch finger in, as opposed in traditional rolled hem, you would take the stitch finger out. So we'll leave the stitch finger as is. Then we increase the tension of the right needle. In my case, I'm going to take it all the way up to 7. We'll leave the upper looper as is. For me, that's usually at 4. And we will also increase the lower looper, and I'm going to take it all the way to number 9. But as always, feel free to experiment and see what gives you the best result. The stitch length is also going to remain at R, or the lowest number that you have on your serger. And from here, you're going to repeat all of the same steps as we did for the previous scrunchie. If you look at these side by side, you can see that on the orange scrunchie, the edge is narrower, but also the color that we inserted in the upper looper loops all the way around to the other side instead of being just on one side, as in the green example. Today's project, we're going to combine quite a few skills that we've learned in previous episodes of this series. We're going to do a round corner, and we're going to go through quite a few layers, which serger is absolutely great for. And in the process, we're going to make a little case for your sunglasses or your readers. The materials are very straightforward. You're going to need fabric for the outside and for the inside, as well as a little bit of batting or some sort of cushiony material to go in between. You can use cotton batting, or in my case, I'm using polyester one. That's just something that I already had on hand. We're going to start by cutting out 3 squares. 2 will be from the fabric and 1 will be from the batting. Each square is about 8 inches by 8 inches, but you can of course come up with your own measurements as well. Now you can leave the corners as they are, but I do prefer them rounded. So I'm going to flip this over, and on this side we're going to round the corner just the tiniest bit. I have a little template, but you can of course do this by hand. You don't have to have a template at all. So here we're just rounding it at just the tiniest bit. We can now flip it the other way around, like this. So on this side we have the rounded corner, on this one we have a straight corner. I'm going to measure down, I would say about 3 inches or so. And from here also 3 inches. Now I want to make sure that I round it very nicely from one point that we marked to the other. And now it's time to cut. Just make sure that you cut only 1 layer of fabric. There you have it. Now we're going to place this square on top of the 2 remaining ones, and we're going to repeat the corners. Next, make sure that you have your sandwich assembled this way. And now with a really rounded corner on one side and with a slightly rounded corner on the other one, we are going to measure about 3 inches down and make a mark, and we're going to do exactly the same on the other side. This is going to mark the direction of our first serger seam. To prevent fabric sliding around, because we have quite a few thick layers, you can go ahead and pin it together. Now, if you are afraid of getting pricked by your pins, then use safety pins instead. After this, we are ready for the serger. Here my serger is set up for a regular 4-thread technique, and I'm going to leave my tension as is. Usually it's set up at 4, 4, 4, and 5 on the lower looper. When I'm serging with quite a few thick layers, I do like to increase my stitch width. In my case, I can go from 5 to 6 or to 7. So I will stick to 6. When it comes to stitch length, I usually apply the same rule of thumb as I do on a sewing machine. So, larger stitches on thicker fabrics and shorter ones on thinner. However, Serger pushes fabric through really well because it has 2 feed dogs. So I will go down to number 2 because I want my stitches to be quite tightly spaced. Now, oftentimes when I do go through the comments underneath my Serger videos, I do see that there is quite a bit of fear around working with a serger, and I always try to remind you that you are the boss and the serger is just a tool, a really great tool, but it's just a tool. It's not a boss. You are the boss. So just remember that. And of course, it does take a little bit of practice, a little bit of skill, a little bit of time getting used to. And if you want all of that and understand how the serger works in and out, what are the moving parts, what are they responsible for, as well as what techniques you can do in troubleshooting of those techniques, then you're in luck, because I just did a full serger series that will go in all of those details, and you can find all episodes in a description right underneath this video, so definitely check it out. Next, let's grab our project and place it underneath the presser foot with this mark right underneath the needles. My fabric is placed right against the blade of the serger because I'm going to be cutting just the tiniest bit, if anything at all. When you're ready, lower your presser foot and let's start serging. When you get to the curve, slowly pivot the project. You can also help by lifting up the presser foot a little bit, readjusting, and then continuing following the curve. We're going to repeat all of the same steps for the other curve as well, all the way to the mark that we have made. Once you're there, lift up the needles, lift up the presser foot, wiggle the project out of the way a little bit, then lower the presser foot and chain off. Also, for your project, you're going to be using a coordinating thread. In my case, I'm using a thread that stands out so that way you can see a little bit better. Next, we're going to fold it in half. We're going to bring the bottom corners together, like so, and then these parts should align. You can start by pinning the corner. Right here, I like to take these thread tails and tuck them to the inside. There we go. And then place one pin over here to hold it all together. Now at the serger, we're going to start right over here, go all the way to the corner, pivot, and finish right here. We're going to start by placing it right underneath the needles in this area. When you're ready, start serging. When you get to the corner, lift up the presser foot, lift up the needles from the project, wiggle the project and pivot it, then place it right back underneath the needles and the presser foot. Make sure that you don't forget to bring back up the tension of the thread so that way you don't end up with a loop at the corner. Then lower the presser foot and continue serging. When you're done, simply chain off. Here's the corner that we just did up close. Now all we have to do is tuck in these thread tails with a latch hook, and that's it. Your case is ready. By the way, this also works great as a cell phone holder. Well, there you have it, another serger project and more skills learned. We're going to complete an entire garment from start to finish, that's right, on a serger. We're going to be working on this little t-shirt, and I will share with you how to do hemming. We're going to talk about some tips and tricks and additional advice, also about the sequence of putting it all together, as well as getting a nice neckline. So without any further ado, let's get started. First, let's start by cutting out the pattern, and here comes the first tip. I draft my own patterns, and when I do them, I draft them without seam allowances, and I add seam allowances as I cut my fabric. Now I do that because different techniques, different seams, and also different machines will require different width of a seam allowance, so that way I can easily adjust it to whatever I need. So for example, a regular 4-thread seam right here on my serger gives me about 1/4 inch in width. So on any knit garments that I'm going to be constructing with a basic 4-thread thread technique, I do 1/4 inch seam allowance. When you're working with a store-bought pattern, a lot of times you will see 5/8 inch seam allowance. So a lot of times, but not all of the time, so definitely read the instructions to the pattern. So if you're using a serger and you're cutting off just the very edge of your fabric, there's going to be a really big difference between 1/4 inch that your serger is taking as the width of the seam and the remaining seam allowance. So the finished garment is going to be that much bigger. If you're not sure what is the width of the seam of a regular 4-thread technique on your serger, then take a scrap piece of fabric, run it through the serger, and then measure it. With that, we are ready to start putting this little t-shirt together. Now, when you are completing your entire project on a serger, a lot of times you have to rethink the sequence of your actions in sewing. So for example, when I do my hems on a serger, I like to do them flat, so that's exactly what is going to be our first step. I'm starting by pressing my hems on all 4 pattern pieces, the 2 sleeves, the front, and the back bodice. My hem depth is about 1 inch. Next, we're going to set up our serger for a flat lock seam. Now, I do have an entire video dedicated to a flat lock seam on a serger and all of the things that you need to know, including problem solving and troubleshooting. So right now, we're going to go through it rather quickly. First, we're going to remove one of the needles. You can remove the left one or the right one. I usually stick to removing the right needle. And then we're going to remove the thread cone that corresponds to that needle. After that, we're going to adjust the tension. And here the flat lock seam is created by loosening up the needle tension and upping the tension on the lower looper. So first of all, you're going to grab the scrap fabric that you have left from cutting up your project. That is really important to test before you actually get to hemming. So I have tested and I've decided that my best tension is if I lower the left needle all the way down to 0. I will leave the right needle as it is because we've taken that out. My upper looper is going to stay at 4, but sometimes you might want to loosen it up. And my lower looper, I'm going to bring all the way up to 7. Also, a flat lock seam is a double-sided technique, so you can choose which one you would like to show on the right side of the fabric. I call them snakes and ladders. If you want the top result, what I call a ladder, then you're going to fold your hem like you would for a regular blind hem stitch, for example, on a sewing machine. If you want the bottom result, you're going to fold your hem the opposite way. From here, stitch width, stitch length, and differential feet are going to stay as they are. However, if you do get a really wavy seam on your knits, up the differential feet, so that way you can remedy that. Now, don't forget to thread it the correct way and also remove or lower the knife because we're not going to be cutting anything off. I have found that a lot of times people are having a really hard time until they actually grab some fabric scraps and try it out. So I definitely suggest to do that so that way you can grasp the concept and feel really confident. So now, let's hem it. Simply place your folded hem underneath the presser foot and run it through the serger. Once done, pull the fabric apart so that way the seam lays flat and then give it a good press. Once all of the hems are done, set up your serger back to a regular 4-thread technique and then we can start putting it all together. For the bodice, take the front and the back, place them right sides together, align them at the side seam and sew them, and align them at the shoulder seam and sew them as well. For the sleeves, place them right sides together at the hem and sew it. While serging your side seam, try to make sure that the stitching of the hems aligns really well, and if it helps, baste it before serging. Next step after that is to sew in the sleeves. You can choose to pin or you can choose to baste it, whichever way is better for you. But when I do, I pay attention to 2 things. In the underarm seam, so this is the side seam, and this is the bottom of the sleeve. I like to nest the seam allowances so that way we create less bulk. And then on the top where we have the shoulder seam, I like for the serge seam allowance to look towards the back side. I like to start my serging at the bottom of the sleeve, so in the underarm section. But don't start right here. Start either a little bit before or a little bit after. That helps me avoid this bulk right off the start.
You can stop, adjust, and then start again. You don't have to complete it all in one go. But if you do stop, make sure that your needles are in the fabric, so that way your seam doesn't move. When you are getting closer to the beginning of your seam, I like to snip off the end, and then we want to serge over it just by about 1/2 inch or so. But don't serge off any of the existing seam because we don't want it to come apart. When you have done that, bring up your needles, bring up your presser foot, wiggle the project out of the way, then lower your presser foot and chain off. That is going to give you a really nice ending of the seam. Sleeves are in, so the last step is the neckband. I started by taking my measuring tape and then measuring the entire neckline back and front of my garment. Then I cut the length of the neckband about 20% shorter than what I just measured, but it does depend on the fabric and how stretchy it is. When it comes to the width of the neckband, I do prefer it to be about 2 inches or 5 centimeters. Next, press the neckband in half. It's easier to do it while it's flat before sewing it at the short ends. Next, bring the short ends together, right sides facing, and then sew it. Serger seam is bulkier than a seam of the sewing machine, plus you can't really press it open. So what I like to do on the neckbands is, first, press the seam allowance in 2 opposite directions on one end and on the other, and then bring the neckband wrong sides together. There we go. This way, once again, you get a nested seam allowance. Fold the neckband in half, and right opposite the center back seam, we're going to make a little snippet, just the tiniest bit. On the neckline, we're going to do the same. Let's place the neckline like so, shoulder seam to shoulder seam at the center front. Make a tiny little snippet, and let's do the same at the center back. Now let's take your neckband. The center back seam is gonna align with the center back notch on the neckline. So, right sides facing, place a little pin. Next, we're going to do the same with the center front snippet and the center front snippet on the neckline. You can visually tell that the neckband is smaller than the neckline because we're going to be stretching it as we sew it in. Just like we did with the sleeve, let's start a little bit before or right after this little bulky area. Place the project underneath the presser foot, lower it, and then manually lower the needles inside of your project. Then I like to find the center front and then pinch it with my fingers. Then I gently stretch out the neckband, aligning the edges with the neckline, and start serging. After I get to the center front notch, I do exactly the same for the second half of the neckband. Once I get all the way to the very beginning, I do exactly the same steps as we did on a sleeve in order to finish it all very neatly. Well, there you have it. We completed an entire t-shirt all on a serger. It's quick, it's easy, it's useful, and as the name suggests, it's made entirely on a serger, so no sewing machine involved whatsoever. And we do these kind of projects so that way you can build your confidence, you can practice your skills, and you can really discover what your serger can do besides just the basic stitch that most likely it is set on. So today we're going to practice how to adjust your stitch length and why we do it, and also how to get a really nice 90-degree corner on your serger. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and let's get started. For this fully lined drawstring bag, we're going to need 5 rectangles. We will need 2 big ones for the outer fabric, 2 big ones for the lining, and you can see all measurements on your screen. And we will also need 1 small one, and that is going to be to create casings for the drawstrings. Now you can of course use any measurements that you would like, but I think that this is a good place where to start. So grab the smallest out of all 5 rectangles, and let's go ahead and give it a really good press. On the short edges, first we're going to fold in 1/4 inch, then give it a good press. Once that is done, fold it in another 1/4 inch and give it another good press. And we're going to repeat that on both sides. Next, we're going to head to your serger, and here mine is set up as for a regular 4-thread serging. So the stitch finger remains in. We have a regular tension. My differential feed is set at 1 as per regular serging. But there's one thing that I do want to adjust just for this little part in this project, and that is stitch length. Now this is going to be visible on the right side of the project, and therefore I like to decrease the stitch length because then it packs the stitches closer together and therefore it makes a really nice trim. My regular setting is usually set at 3 and I will go down all the way to R. Before starting, you might also want to disengage your knife. Most sergers have this function, and if you're not sure how to do it on your serger, just go ahead and take a quick peek in your serger manual. After that, take your fabric, place it right side up right underneath the serger presser foot, then lower the presser foot and start serging. When you're done, this is what you're going to have, and it's exactly the same technique as we used for our serger scrunchies. Now, if you're just not a fan, I totally understand. We're all different. In this case, just use a regular 4-thread serging technique set for a regular stitch length and you'll be all good. Now, let's grab our rectangle, fold it in half, and give it a good press. Once done, cut along the fold. Next, fold each one of these in half again and give it a good press. For the time being, we can set these aside. Now, grab the large rectangles, and first we're going to tackle the outer fabric. Here, we're going to place the fabric right sides facing, like so. And we're going to sew 3 sides, starting right here, all the way to the bottom, like this, and again all the way to the top. We're going to repeat the same for the lining, but here, however, we're only going to sew the sides. So we're going to leave the bottom and the top open. At the serger, we're going to keep all of the same settings, but in my case, I'm gonna go back to a regular stitch length because for this part, we don't need a tightly packed stitches as I wanted for decorative purposes in the first part. I am also bringing the knife back. Now we're ready. Grab your project, place it underneath your serger presser foot, and start serging. Once we get closer to the bottom, we want to serge all the way till the very edge. On the presser foot right over here, there is a little window where the needles are going through. This is a great way how to track if you're really near the bottom. So once you are, you want to lift up your presser foot and you want to take your project and you want to gently pull it away. Now you can turn it, and with that, now you can place your project right back underneath the presser foot, right where the needles will start serging. Now lower the presser foot and you can continue. Now if you have noticed that you have pulled your project way too much, that's totally fine. Right here, you can pull on those threads so that way you can bring it back in and you're not going to have bubbling threads at the corners. On the lining, it's way easier, just 2 straight lines as I previously mentioned. For this next step, let's take our outside fabric and turn it right side out. To be able to turn these corners out nicely without any snipping, I like to fold in the first seam allowance in like this, and then the second seam allowance in like this. Hold the corner with your finger, and then turn. At this point, you can also give this part a good press. Now grab the drawstring casings and some pins. First, we're going to attach it to the outer fabric. We're going to place one like this, centered, and then we're going to pin it just to one layer of fabric. Then we're going to flip it, and we're going to do exactly the same thing. Once done, we're going to grab the lining and going to pop it open like this, and we're going to pull it up like that. Right sides of the lining facing the right side of the outer fabric. We want to align side seam with a side seam, and once you have that, go ahead, pop the pins out, and now place them through all layers of fabric. Once again, we're going to repeat that on the other side as well. Next, we're going to take it to the serger and serge all the way around all layers together. Nesting seam allowances can be really important when it comes to working with a serger. That's when one seam allowance is looking one direction and the other is looking the other direction. It makes it easier to go through all of the layers. Since all of this is going to be hidden inside of the bag, you don't necessarily have to secure the thread. Nothing is going to happen with it, so you can just leave it as is if you'd like. Now, let's turn it like so. And we are ready for the last and final step. To close the lining, we have two options. We can either simply serge this part, both layers together, and that's it. Or you can fold it in about 1/4 of an inch or 3/8 of an inch, finger press or press with an iron, and then serge it. So whichever way you'd prefer. Make sure you tuck in these little serger tails, and now we can pop the lining back inside of our bag. For the strings, I have 2 pieces of cord. Each is about 22 inches long. We're going to place one in a loop like this. One then is going to go through one casing, the other through the other, and the second cord is going to go in the opposite direction. If you want to see more serger projects, then definitely click right over here and subscribe to the channel. And if you'd like to see how I made this blouse entirely from fabric scraps and from an upcycling fail, then click on the video right over here. Thank you so much for watching. Happy serging, happy sewing, and I will see you very soon in another video. Bye!